The drive at Ashfield Park had not changed. 3 miles of lime-lined road cutting through the Derbyshire hills, the trees bare now in late November, their branches making a gray lattice against a sky that could not decide between cloud and pale winter sun. Eleanor Vane had told herself, every mile of the hired carriage, that she would not feel anything when she saw the house. She had told herself this very firmly, with the particular firmness of someone who does not believe it. She felt it when the great stone facade came into view above the rise. The east wing's shutters were still drawn, the way they had always been, the way they had been for 3 years before she arrived, and presumably 3 years after she departed. The lime trees cast their gray shadows across the gravel. The fountain near the south terrace had been emptied for the winter, a stone basin holding nothing but dead leaves and the memory of sound. Eleanor looked at it as the carriage slowed and tried to remember that she was here only to deliver a bank draft, sign Mr. Hawkins's papers, and be gone by dark. The footman who descended to take her bag was a young man she did not recognize. That was some mercy. She crossed the threshold of the great hall alone. The house smelled of beeswax and cold stone, and, faintly, of the cedar shavings the housekeeper used against moths, and the smell went through Eleanor like something she had not prepared for. She had been inside this hall 1,000 times. She had walked the length of it with a lamp at 10 o'clock at night, checking that the fire screens were set. She had polished the oak side table nearest the stairs, on her hands and knees. She had stood at the far window during a summer thunderstorm, and watched the lightning come down over the hills, and felt, for one quiet hour, that she was a person who lived in the world. She was looking at that window when she heard footsteps on the marble stair. Henry Ashford, Earl of Ashfield, descended in silence. He was dressed for the morning, a dark blue coat that fit across his shoulders with the precision of good tailoring, his cravat tied without artifice. He reached the landing and stopped. He saw her. Eleanor had anticipated formality. She had anticipated the careful nothing of a man greeting a servant who had once kept his library. She had not anticipated the quality of his stillness. He stood at the foot of the stair with his hand resting on the newel post, and he did not speak, and the silence was not cold. It was the silence of a man who has been very still for a long time, and finds himself unable to move in either direction. What she did not yet know was that Henry Ashford had had a great deal of practice being still, and that every instance of stillness had cost him something he had not expected to pay. She dipped her head. "My lord, I apologize for the early hour. Mr. Hawkins wrote to say the accounts require a signature from both parties before the estate is closed. I will not take much of your time." He said, "You have taken none of it yet, Miss Vane." His voice was exactly as she remembered, low, precise, uninflected in the way that some people mistook for coldness. She had not mistaken it for coldness once. She had understood it as a kind of discipline. Whether that understanding had been correct was a question she was no longer permitted to consider. "If I might wait in the housekeeper's room until Mr. Hawkins arrives," she said, "I would be grateful." He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than courtesy required. Then he said, "You will wait in the morning room. I will send for Mrs. Pryor." It was not an invitation. It was a disposition of the matter, issued in the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Eleanor's hands were perfectly still at her sides. She could feel her pulse in the base of her throat. She had forgotten about that. She had, in 18 months, genuinely forgotten about that. Eleanor Vane had come to Ashfield Park 3 years ago at 21, with a leather traveling bag, a small amount of money her father's solicitor had managed to salvage from the debts, and the intelligence to understand her own situation clearly. Her father, the Reverend Thomas Vane, had been a clergyman of considerable learning and impractical financial judgment. He had invested badly, borrowed against the living, and died in the autumn, leaving Eleanor with his books, his debts, and the goodwill of a distant cousin who had written to Lady Ashfield's housekeeper on her behalf. The position was companion to the Dowager Countess when the Dowager was in residence, and assistant to Mrs. Pryor in all other management of the house. Eleanor had understood that this meant she existed in the uncomfortable middle space of every great house, too educated for the servants' hall, too poor for the drawing room. She had navigated it with the particular quiet competence of someone who has no other option. She had been good at it. She had kept the library catalogued, the correspondence organized, the nursery, the East Wing's nursery. She had not been asked to attend to. The East Wing remained closed. The Earl himself had been, for the first year, barely present. He spent most of his time in London, or at the hunting box in Yorkshire, or anywhere that was not Ashfield. When he was present, he was the kind of quiet that a household learns to accommodate, a quietness that was not unkindness, but that could not be approached without careful preparation. Eleanor had not tried to approach it. She had kept the library. The second year he had begun to use the library in the evenings. She had, at first, gathered her things and retreated when he appeared. He had said, once, without looking up from the document he was reading, "You need not go on my account." She had, cautiously, stayed. It was the beginning of something she had told herself, with great firmness and limited success, was not what it appeared to be. She had been in the morning room a quarter of an hour, her hands folded over her reticule, when Mrs. Pryor came through the door. Agnes Pryor was 60, with the constitution of an oak tree, and the expression of someone who has managed a great house through several difficult decades without losing either her memory or her sense of what mattered. She looked at Eleanor for a moment, and then she crossed the room and took both of Eleanor's hands in hers, which was not at all the correct behavior for a housekeeper greeting a former companion who had left under ambiguous circumstances, and which was the most welcome thing Eleanor had felt in a considerable time. "You look thin," Mrs. Pryor said. "I am perfectly well," Eleanor said. "You look thin," Mrs. Pryor repeated, in the tone of someone who has closed a question rather than answered it. She sat down beside Eleanor and looked at her steadily. "How long will Mr. Hawkins require you?" "A few hours at most. I had hoped to be away before the afternoon." Mrs. Pryor's expression shifted by a degree too small for most people to read. Eleanor was not most people. "There is a house party," the older woman said. "Arrived yesterday. Her ladyship's doing." Eleanor did not ask what that meant. She did not need to. Lady Constance Ashfield, the Dowager Countess, had been managing her son's social life since before he understood what social life was. She had managed it through his first marriage, a practical match that had nonetheless been happy enough. She had managed it through the grief that followed. She managed it now with the serene authority of a woman who knows exactly what the world owes her family and has every intention of collecting. When Eleanor had last been at Ashfield, the Dowager had looked upon her with the mild attention one might give a well-trained spaniel. She was useful. She was quiet. She was not a problem. Then, apparently, she had become a problem. The exact mechanism of her dismissal remained unclear to her even now. She had been summoned to the Dowager's sitting room on a November morning 18 months past and been told, with polished precision, that her services were no longer required, that her character reference would be provided with every discretion, and that she should be gone from Ashfield by the following dawn. When Eleanor had asked the reason, Lady Constance had said only that the household's requirements had changed. The household's requirements, as though she were a piece of furniture no longer suited to the room. She had gone. She had not seen the Earl before she left. She had told herself in the carriage that this was confirmation of what she already knew. She had told herself this so many times that she had nearly made herself believe it. She was considering the morning room's fire with the fixed attention of someone not thinking about fire. The grate was the old cast-iron kind, the kind she had cleaned and dressed herself during her second winter at Ashfield, and the sound it made settling was a sound she knew from inside out. She had carried coal scuttles in this house at 6:30 in the morning before anyone was awake. She had let herself be domestic inside rooms this fine, and for 1 or 2 quiet years that had been enough. She was still looking at the fire when Lady Constance entered. The dowager was in gray silk, a color that suited her formidably. Miss Bramford came in behind her, a young woman of 26, with bright eyes and a fashionable morning dress in pale blue, the kind of woman for whom every room arranges itself as a backdrop. Lady Constance looked at Eleanor with precisely the fraction of recognition appropriate for a household account to be settled. No more. "Miss Vane," the dowager said. "I had not expected Mr. Hawkins until afternoon. The morning was clearer than anticipated, my lady. I apologize for the disruption." Lady Constance inclined her head and turned to Miss Bramford. "That is merely the old companion come to settle accounts," she said, her voice carrying the bright certainty of someone speaking in front of furniture. "She is nothing now. We shall not let her interrupt the morning." She touched Miss Bramford's arm and guided her toward the far window with the practiced ease of a woman who has spent 50 years deciding who belongs in a room. Eleanor kept her eyes on the fire. She heard Miss Bramford say something quiet and kind, too low to catch. She heard Lady Constance's murmured response. She was aware, precisely, of the social mechanics at work, the introduction of a suitable match, the house party arranged as stage dressing, the morning's event designed to progress without her interference. The morning room door opened again. He entered, and the room rearranged itself around him the way rooms do for men of a certain rank, not through performance, but through a kind of gravitational fact. He looked at Eleanor before he looked at anyone else. Miss Bramford was the first to speak. She was pleasant, genuinely so, which Eleanor found made everything more complicated. "Lord Ashfield, your mother has been showing me the autumn views. The light is quite unlike anything in town." "The North Terrace is better," he said without quite agreeing. He moved to the side table and looked at the correspondence left there. "Miss Vane, have you had tea?" "I am perfectly comfortable, my lord." "That was not what I asked." Eleanor looked up at him. There was something in his expression she could not quite account for, a kind of controlled attention that sat differently from his usual composure. The dowager, she noted from the edge of her vision, had become very still. "No," Eleanor said. "I have not." "Then you will have some," he said, and rang the bell with the same brevity he brought to all practical decisions. The dowager said, with the warmth of a winter sun, "Henry, Miss Bramford was hoping to see the portrait gallery before luncheon. I had promised to take her." "The gallery will keep until afternoon," he said. The morning room held its breath. Eleanor looked at the fire and felt, with a precision she found unwelcome, the pulse at the base of her throat. If you have stayed with this story to its first turn, you may already sense what Eleanor cannot yet allow herself to think. Stay a little longer. The library at Ashfield was in the south wing. 2 floors of books behind glass that caught the morning light. With a rolling ladder that had needed repairing for as long as Eleanor could remember, and which she had once oiled herself with the housekeeper's permission. She came to it that afternoon for her own reasons. The estate accounts included a small catalogue of volumes that had been transferred during her tenure, and Mr. Hawkins had asked her to confirm 2 of the entries. She had confirmed them in a quarter of an hour. She remained for reasons she did not formally acknowledge. The south end of the library held the histories and natural philosophy. The north end, behind the reading chairs, held the collection she had helped recatalogue during her second year: correspondence volumes, household records, and ledgers. And on the lowest shelf, where it had always been, the nursery record book. She had not intended to look at it. She found herself looking at it nonetheless. It was a green leather volume, the kind made by an estate bookseller for general household record. Inside the cover, in a woman's hand, was a list of dates and entries: the arrival of a cradle from London, the selection of a nurse, the ordering of a christening gown. The last entry was a date in early spring, 3 years past. There was nothing after it. Eleanor looked at it for a long moment. Then she closed it gently, pressing her hand flat against the cover, feeling the grain of the old leather under her palm. She held it for a breath. Then she returned it to its place on the shelf, with the quiet precision of someone who understands that some things do not belong to her to handle, but can still be treated with care. She did not hear the library door open. The Earl had come without announcement, as he always had. With the particular silent certainty of a man in his own house. He stood in the doorway of the north alcove and watched her replace the volume on its shelf. He watched her brush the dust from the shelf's edge with the hem of her sleeve. He watched her straighten and turn, and when she saw him, both of them went still in the library's cold afternoon light. "I apologize," she said. "I did not hear you." He was quiet for a moment. "You kept the catalog," he said finally. "When you were here, you reorganized the lower shelves." "It was not a question. I did. The nursery record was not in the right place before. It was with the household ledgers. I moved it to the family history section. I hope that was not improper." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "It was not." He came into the library and stood near the reading chairs, at a distance that propriety required, and that felt, in the silence of the room, both correct and insufficient. He wore no coat, as if he had come directly from his study and not thought to collect it, and his shirt sleeves were turned once at the cuff, a small disorder that Eleanor had never seen in him before, and that seemed, in the cold quiet of the afternoon library, entirely eloquent. He looked at the shelf where she had replaced the volume. He said, "My wife kept that record from the week she knew she was expecting." Eleanor said nothing. She knew better, by now, than to fill a silence he had not finished with. "She died in April," he said. "The child did not survive the week." He said it plainly, without the modulation of a man performing grief, the way one states a fact that has been lived with long enough to be spoken without breaking. "I closed the East Wing because I could not determine what else to do. The books in the library I could not bring myself to rearrange. You found them disordered." "They were in some disorder," Eleanor said carefully. "You put them to rights." He was looking at her now with an expression she had spent 18 months trying to forget the exact texture of. "You treated the household as though it mattered," he said. "Not as an assignment, as though it mattered." She said, "It did matter. It does. Ashfield is, if I may say so, a house worth keeping." Something shifted in his face, not dramatically, not with any visible alteration that the Dowager or Miss Bramford might have pointed to and named. A small easing, a breath taken, and then released at a different depth than the one before it. "You will stay to dinner," he said. It came out as it always did, a command dressed in the syntax of an offer. "Mr. Hawkins will not be ready until morning in any case. The accounts require his clerk, and the clerk does not arrive until tomorrow." Eleanor looked at him. She had, in all the months away, told herself the story in which he had not noticed her departure. She had told it very carefully, with great attention to the evidence. She had believed it because she needed to. "I would not wish to intrude on your house party," she said. "You are not intruding," he said. "You are here at my invitation." She stayed to dinner. The dining room at Ashfield held 14 comfortably, and Lady Constance had made it hold 12, which was a message about the house party's intimacy and its ambitions delivered in the language of seating charts. Miss Bramford sat at the Earl's right. Eleanor was placed at the foot of the table's least strategic end, near the Honorable Mr. Hartwell, a pleasant young man who talked about his horses. The soup course was cleared before Lady Constance addressed the table generally. She did it with the precision of a woman who has spent 50 years understanding which social moment to choose. "We must not waste the Earl's evening on a companion's errand," she said, her voice carrying the warm authority of someone administering good advice to a room. "Miss Bramford has been kind enough to come all this way. Henry, I hope you will take her through the portrait gallery tomorrow. The North Corridor has several new acquisitions worth seeing." The table received this with the polite attention of people accustomed to the dowager's architectural maneuvers. Eleanor kept her eyes on her soup plate. Beside her, Mr. Hartwell cleared his throat and said something about the south field that required no response. At the other end of the table, the Earl said, "The gallery will keep, Mother." It was exactly what he had said that morning. The repetition was not accidental. Eleanor was quite certain of that, and quite certain she should not be certain of it. He looked down the length of the table. He did not look at her directly. Eleanor was nonetheless aware, with the particular awareness that had no rational name, that lived in the quality of the air and the angle of a turned shoulder, and the stillness of a man trying not to be still, that she was where his attention was. She was also aware of Lady Constance noting that awareness. The candles at the center of the table were the heavy beeswax kind, the kind that burned long and smelled faintly of honey. Eleanor had helped order those candles for 3 years. The silver épergne in the center she had polished in October twice running, learning the pattern of the repoussé from the inside of each fold. The table itself she had walked 1,000 times with a cloth and a pot of beeswax, following the grain until the mahogany held light. She had loved this house. She had tried to love it quietly, which was the only permissible form. Miss Bramford, who had the native kindness of a woman secure in her own station, turned to Eleanor after the fish course and asked pleasantly whether she had known Ashfield in the summers. There was nothing unkind in the question. Eleanor answered it. She was aware, as she spoke, of the Earl at the far end of the table, the line of his jaw in the candlelight, his hand resting beside his wineglass with the deliberate stillness of a man who has trained himself not to reach. She wanted, very suddenly, and with a precision that alarmed her, to be allowed to stop being careful. The evening ended the way evenings at great houses end. The ladies withdrew. The men sat over their port, and Eleanor made her way toward the passage that led to the guest wing. Mrs. Pryor met her in the corridor. The housekeeper's expression, which Eleanor had learned over 3 years to read as accurately as a barometer, carried something she had not expected. Not worry. Something more deliberate than worry. "Come with me," Mrs. Pryor said. She did not say where. Eleanor, who trusted Agnes Pryor more than she had trusted most people in her adult life, came. They walked not toward the guest wing, but toward the private corridor of the main house, a passage Eleanor had entered no more than twice, on legitimate household errands. Mrs. Pryor carried a single candle. The corridor was paneled in old oak, and the light ran along it with a warmth that had nothing to do with what Eleanor was about to feel. Mrs. Pryor stopped before a doorway at the corridor's end. Above the lintel, in an oval frame that Eleanor recognized as one of the estate's own, walnut, slightly irregular at the top right corner, the kind made by a local craftsman rather than a London supplier. A portrait hung there. Eleanor looked at it. The woman in the portrait was dressed plainly, in the gray and white of household service. She sat at a writing table with a ledger open before her, her pen at rest, her head turned slightly as though something had moved at the edge of her vision. Her hair was up in the practical way of someone at work. Her expression was not arranged for a portrait's occasion. She had the look of someone who had been caught at the moment of attention, when her guard was precisely not engaged. It was Eleanor. Unmistakably Eleanor. She stood in the corridor and looked at her own face above the Earl of Ashfield's bedroom door. Mrs. Pryor said very quietly, "He commissioned it 8 months after you left. He described you from memory to Whitmore, the estate painter. Whitmore said it took 3 sittings in reverse because his lordship kept correcting details. The angle of the wrist, the way the pen rested, he wanted it exact." Eleanor said nothing. "He asked me once what your given name was, because he said he did not know it well enough. I told him it was Eleanor. He did not say anything else. He had it hung there a week after Whitmore finished it." Eleanor looked at the portrait. She looked at her own face, caught at the moment of attention, in a frame above the most private door in the house. "He believed you left willingly," Mrs. Pryor said. "That you gave no notice because you chose not to." Eleanor turned and looked at her. "I did not know," Mrs. Pryor said, with the careful honesty of a woman who had asked herself the same question many times. "How much of it was the dowager's doing until 3 months ago? A letter came for you, from Lady Constance, misdirected to the Vane address. The footman who forwarded it told me what had been in the original instruction. He was clearing his conscience before he left Ashfield's service." She paused. "She told the household you had behaved improperly with young Davy Holt. She told you the household's requirements had changed. Neither account was true." The candle was the only sound in the corridor. The flame moved slightly in the draught from the stair. "I see," Eleanor said. The words were inadequate. She said them anyway, because her voice was not fully at her disposal. She looked at the portrait once more. She looked at her own face, which Whitmore had caught in a moment of attention she had not known was being noted. She looked at the careful pen, the angle of the wrist, the way a man had described her from memory, and then corrected the details. 3 sessions, until it was exact. She went back to the guest room and did not sleep. She sat at the window and looked at the lime trees in the dark, the bare branches making their gray lattice against the night sky, and she conducted a private reckoning with herself that was not comfortable and was not brief. She thought about what it meant to have been seen before she knew she was being looked at. She thought about a man describing the angle of a wrist to a painter, specifying, correcting, until the detail was exact, and then hanging the result above his own door in the most private corridor of his house. She thought about what it cost a man like him to have done that, and what it had cost her to not know it for 18 months. At 3 a.m, she made her decision. She would take Mr. Hawkins's papers at dawn, sign what required signing, and be gone before the house party came down to breakfast. She would be gone because staying, now, cost more than she had. She was in the front hall at 6:30 with her traveling bag. The hall was cold and gray, the fire not yet lit, the marble floor wearing the particular pallor of early morning. Mr. Hawkins's clerk arrived from the village at 20 past and stood near the door with his document case, a young man of notable nervousness who kept looking at the staircase. Eleanor understood his nervousness when Lady Constance descended. The dowager was dressed with the precision of a woman who has never in her adult life been caught unprepared. She came down the stair in a dark morning gown and looked at Eleanor with the expression of a woman who has calculated the situation and found it manageable. "I see you are sensible," the dowager said. "That is, I confess, somewhat more than I expected." Eleanor looked at her. She said, with the directness she had given herself permission to use at 3 in the morning, "Was it because he noticed me? Or was it simply that I was unsuitable, and you preferred not to wait to see what came of it?" The dowager was quiet for a moment. She was, Eleanor had always known, a woman of considerable intelligence, which was part of what made her dangerous and also part of what made certain things possible. "Both," Lady Constance said. It was not what Eleanor had expected. "He noticed you in the way he had not noticed anything since Catherine died. I was not prepared for that. I am still not certain it was the wrong decision." She said it with the self-possession of a woman making a case she still believed in, which Eleanor found, perversely, more respectable than a lie. "You will tell him what you told me," Eleanor said. "I will not," Lady Constance said. "You may tell him yourself, if you choose. I will not contradict it." It was, Eleanor thought, an interesting form of concession from a woman who did not concede anything she did not calculate. She was still parsing it when she heard steps on the stair behind the dowager. He came down the stairs in his morning coat, without haste, with the quality of stillness that meant he had been moving very deliberately for some time. Behind him, visible for a moment on the landing, Mr. Hawkins stood with his own document case. The Earl looked at Eleanor's traveling bag. He looked at her face. He came the rest of the way down the stair and stopped 3 feet from her on the marble floor. The clerk near the door had gone very still. The dowager had gone very still. The morning hall held its breath. Eleanor said, "My lord, I think it would be correct for you to know that I did not leave Ashfield of my own choosing. I was dismissed. Your mother will confirm it if you ask her." She watched him look at his mother. She watched something move across his face. Not the unmasking of anger, but something older and more contained, the recognition of a cost already paid. He looked back at Eleanor. He said, "She was never the companion. She was the reason I stayed." It was spoken simply, the way he spoke all things that mattered, without ornament. It was directed to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone present. The dowager did not move. The clerk made a small sound he immediately suppressed. Mr. Hawkins, on the landing above, was looking at his papers. Eleanor said, after a moment, "You stayed for a portrait of a woman you believed had left you." He looked at her steadily. "I stayed because it was still the house where she had been." That seemed sufficient. She stood in the cold hall with her traveling bag on the floor beside her and felt the particular warmth of being seen by a person whose seeing reorders things. She had spent 18 months learning not to want that warmth. She found, standing in it again, that she had not learned it at all. She had only learned to survive its absence. "Mr. Hawkins," Henry said, turning slightly toward the landing, "the accounts will require rather more discussion than anticipated. Will you stay to luncheon?" Mr. Hawkins, who was a man of long professional experience and therefore understood that what had just happened in the front hall was not primarily about accounts, said that he would be most pleased to stay. Lady Constance said nothing. She looked at her son with an expression that might, to a careful observer, have contained the very beginning of a reckoning with herself. She was not defeated. She was, Eleanor thought, simply accurate enough to understand that a particular script had reached its last page, and to begin, with whatever grace she could manage, to turn it. She turned and went back up the stair without speaking. Eleanor watched her go. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the strange calm of a storm that has found its end. Henry picked up Eleanor's traveling bag from the floor. It was a simple, deliberate action, the kind that costs nothing to describe and everything to receive. He held it as though he intended to carry it somewhere other than the door. "Come and have some breakfast," he said. "You still look thin." Eleanor looked at him. She thought, with a helpless clarity, that she had forgotten he was capable of that dry precision at entirely the wrong moments, and that she had apparently not forgotten it at all. "You sound like Mrs. Pryor," she said. Something happened to his face that was almost the expression she had been waiting 3 years to see. Not quite a smile, the nearest approach. "I have known her longer," he said. They sat in the small breakfast room, not the formal dining room, but the one with the south window, the one Eleanor had always loved, because it caught the morning light directly. It was warmer than the rest of the house and smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and he poured her tea with the concentration of a man who had thought about this moment more specifically than he would ever say. He told her, before the toast arrived, what he had told no one except Mrs. Pryor, that he had walked the South Library every evening for a month after she left, looking for something displaced, something not right, trying to understand why the catalog she had kept felt like an absence rather than a record. He said that he had found, in the second month, that he was rearranging books she had ordered and then replacing them the way she had had them, which he recognized, even then, as something that would not bear close examination. He said that he had asked the estate painter to begin the portrait when he found himself unable to tell Whitmore what Miss Bramford's eyes were like, asked a second time by his mother, and unable to recall the color from a dinner at which she had sat directly across the table, that he had asked Whitmore to begin the portrait when he understood that he could not describe anyone else in the house with the same degree of accuracy, and that the accuracy had frightened him. He said these things plainly, without decoration, looking at the table, rather than at her, with the particular honesty of a man who has decided that the cost of one more silence is larger than the cost of speech. Eleanor listened. She kept her hands around her cup and let the warmth of it come through the china and thought about the nursery record book on its shelf and about a woman who had kept that record from the first week and about the particular trust required to grieve one person while making room for the possibility of another. She said, "When I closed the record book, I thought about what it meant to keep a thing properly, to catalog it and leave it where it can be found." He looked up at her then. "I would like to stay," she said, "if that is what you are asking. I think you are asking, but you are not asking directly, because you are waiting to see whether I will still go." "That is precisely it," he said. "I will not go," she said. He reached across the breakfast table and placed his hand over hers, the gesture quiet and unhurried, the way a man might close a book he has been meaning to reach for a long time. He did it simply, without ceremony, and then held very still, as though the weight of the contact was something he was taking his time with. Eleanor felt her pulse in her wrist beneath his hand and did not try to compose her expression into anything other than what it was. They remained like that for a long moment while the winter sun came through the south window and the fire settled in the grate, and somewhere in the house Mrs. Pryor's footsteps moved through the corridor with the unhurried certainty of someone who has been waiting for a particular morning for quite some time and is content, now, to let it proceed. The dowager did not come to breakfast. Miss Bramford, when she appeared an hour later, displayed the genuine good nature of a woman who had always understood herself to be the second choice in a particular game, and who received the news with a graciousness that Eleanor found herself admiring unreservedly. She stayed 2 more days, took her tour of the gallery with Mr. Hartwell, and departed for Yorkshire with her reputation and her sense of herself intact. Lady Constance saw her off with the careful efficiency of a woman resettling her position in a landscape that had shifted without her permission. The engagement was confirmed 3 weeks later in the drawing room, with Mr. Hawkins in attendance and the solicitor's papers spread on the library table. Mrs. Pryor served the tea. Henry signed first, then Eleanor, in the hand she had trained at her father's writing table in the Derbyshire clergyman's house, which was not unlike the hand in the portrait on the wall above the bedroom door. She had not asked him to take it down. She had not offered to sit for another. It seemed to her that the portrait above the door was the record of a truth that had existed before he could say it, and that removing it would be the wrong kind of honesty. Henry, when she told him this one evening in the library, had looked at her with the expression she had by then seen often enough to know by heart. "I was going to ask you," he said. "I know," she said. "And you would have told me to leave it." "I would have told you to leave it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the dry precision she had come to love the way one loves the return of a particular quality of light, "I am glad we settled that." She was reading by the time the first snow came to Ashfield. She heard it before she saw it, the particular hush that falls when snow begins in earnest, a silence that is its own kind of sound. She looked up from her book. Henry was at his desk with the estate accounts, as he was most evenings. And the fire had settled to a deep, steady burn, and the lime trees outside the window were disappearing slowly into white. She thought about the drive in November. 3 miles of bare branches against a gray sky. She thought about the fountain in its empty basin. She thought about arriving with a traveling bag and the intention of leaving by dark. She thought about a portrait above a door, and a man who had described the angle of a wrist until it was exact. Outside, the snow covered the gravel and the fountain and the south terrace and the long drive, and the house became, in the particular way of houses in the first snow of winter, entirely its own world. In the private corridor upstairs, the portrait above the door caught no candlelight at this hour, but it was there all the same, in the walnut frame with the slight irregularity at the top right corner, the woman at the writing table turning her head at the edge of her vision. It would remain there. Eleanor had decided so, and Henry had not asked again, and between them that was a settled thing. Eleanor turned the page of her book. Henry looked up from his accounts and looked at her with the expression that had nothing in it of discipline or restraint and everything in it of a man who has come home. The fire settled once more. The snow fell. Ashfield held them both. If Eleanor's homecoming found its way to you, leave a thought in the quiet below. There is always someone waiting to be seen.